What's up, people? This one has been in the works for quite some time, and I couldn't be more excited. This week I had the great pleasure of chatting with Galen Watts, whom I personally think is one of the most interesting young academics and budding public intellectuals, along with Matt McManus, whom I've been raving about endlessly on the pod since discovering his work on postmodern conservatism. That said, I first discovered Galen's work through a co-authored op-ed piece he wrote with McManus over at Arrow magazine entitled How the Engaged Left Can Argue with the Right back in 2019 when he was still completing his PhD under the great political philosopher Will Kalicka. Galen's work has hit me on so many levels due to my background in religious studies and interest in the life of Michael Brooks, Robert Bellah, and many other subjects, as you will hear shortly. As per his research bio online, his primary area of specialization is in the history of religion and culture in the late 1960s and beyond. Though primarily a culture sociologist, his scholarship blurs the boundaries between sociology and philosophy. He uses qualitative methods, participant observations, and interviews to engage with and reflect on key social and political theoretical questions, the nature of modernity, the quest for justice, and what it means to be human. His doctoral thesis, The Religion of the Heart, Self-Solidarity, and the Sacred and Romantic Liberal Modernity, examined the shift from religion to spirituality in liberal democracies, often known as the spiritual turn, and its socio-political implications. Drawing from empirical research in both spiritual but not religious and charismatic Christian study participants in Canada, he identified an enduring cultural structure underlying talk of spirituality in contemporary Western societies, which he calls the religion of the heart. Challenging secularization and rational choice approaches in the study of religion, Galen advances a distinct cultural sociological approach to the sociology of contemporary religion, one that vividly brings into view the changing nature of religion in the 21st century. That said, hope you all enjoy our conversation. And like usual, make sure to check out my Medium page for further reading, references, and notes. Cheers. All right. Well, here we are. Galen, thank you so much. Like I was just saying, I'm a huge fan of your work, and this is just a great opportunity for me. I've been thinking about your work in dialogue with a few other thinkers, collaborators of yours. So I'm really hoping to kind of dig into that and just have a broad conversation about your new book, obviously, that just relatively came out. I guess, when did the official publication date come out?
It came out in April in the UK, and it just came out recently in North America.
Gotcha.
I think in the past few weeks, actually.
Okay, because I managed to get an electronic copy of it, so I've been reading that. I read it over the course of the summer. And the title is The Spiritual Turn, The Religion of the Heart, and the Making of Romantic Liberal Modernity. And it was a fantastic read. I really enjoyed it. One, because my background is actually officially in religious studies.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, and you touched on so many themes and subjects and authors that have inspired me over the years, including obviously your PhD supervisor, Will Kalicka. Yeah. So, just to know that he's in the background of this work as well is just a huge interest to me. But it's also a huge honor to go and meet one of his students and stuff like that, and sit down with you and have a chat. So I was just going to say, I'm really happy to be here, and thank you very much for the opportunity, Eric. It's a very strange thing to hear somebody say that they're a fan. That doesn't normally happen, and it's very nice. So thank you. Yeah. No, for sure. And Robert Bellah seems to have had a huge influence on you as well. And he's over the course of my religious studies, it was just somebody that I just looked up to tremendously. And anytime I was sitting down writing a paper or thinking, I was always going through his way of framing things, and his work is just a huge inspiration for me. So And I can feel that coming through your work. So
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, I was definitely trying to channel my inner Bellah.
yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic. Okay. Well, I mean, I guess I'll just start off a bit as well in terms of how I discovered your work. Because originally, I mean, I discovered your work through your online collaboration with Matt McManus in terms of a few articles that you guys wrote on the New Engage left, or what you guys are calling the New Engage left. And again, that was very inspirational for me as well to go out and see that, the way you guys were articulating that. And I think you guys were really tapping into a particular moment. Um, and the other individual, and it's actually one of the main reasons why I kind of launched this podcast, is Michael Brooks.
Hmm.
So when I'm reading your work or read Matt's work, I'm always kind of reading it in dialogue with Michael Brooks and some of the work that he was doing as well. So I guess my first question to you is, I mean, how did you kind of get turned on to the idea of studying, the idea of spirituality and, obviously in terms of the not religious, but spiritual sort of demographic? I mean, how did that come about for you
Yeah.
over the course of your studies?
So it's a great question, and I'm going to try and be relatively brief because this is the kind of question that opens up all kinds of cans. So, I would say that so I did an undergrad in philosophy at Queen's, and at the time in my undergrad, I was really interested in political, theoretical, or political philosophical questions. I was really interested in egalitarianism and liberalism, kind of big questions about liberalism. And, that sort of had me in the world of Charles Taylor and Rawls and that kind of stuff. And but then, for kind of having had been personal experiences throughout my undergrad that led me to really sort of, in a way, it kind of opened up my mind to questions of religion, which had never prior to that been on my radar. I grew up in a really, I usually describe it as a kind of a religious home. It wasn't, religion just was not a topic. It wasn't that we disliked it or that we were kind of against it. We just did not enter into my consciousness. And it was kind of, out of what happened during my undergrad, I had some difficult experiences that led me to become really interested in questions of religion, just personally. And I, I was, so I had this background interest in kind of political philosophical questions about justice and equality. And then I had some quite personal issues that led me to become interested in religion, and soon also interested in what today goes by spirituality. There's a whole sort of section in the bookstore about spirituality.
Mm.
And so I, became acquainted with that section quite closely. And so at first it was more a kind of personal interest in trying to, figure out my own kind of issues. And then in the last year of my undergrad, as I said, I was still in philosophy. I actually came across a book that connected a whole bunch of things that I had never connected before. And, this relates back to Bellah. So I read Habits of the Heart.
Oh, nice.
It was a book that really, and I, I talk about this in the first chapter of my book. Habits of the Heart really, it hit me hard. Something about it, both in terms of the style of it, the tone, the way it's written. It's very kind of, you're in dialogue. I think you really get the sense that you're being, sort of welcomed in as a kind of conversation partner. And I really like that. And then also, just the substance of it. It's about, I mean, the subtitle is Individualism and Commitment in American Life. And I just saw myself so clearly in this book.
Yeah.
And in a way that actually really was quite disturbing. Like it made a lot of sense to me And it actually kind of helped me understand some of the kind of personal issues that I was going through. And it also connected. It was the first time I really encountered a kind of social scientific or sociological approach to thinking about spirituality. This thing that, as I said, I'd really only had a kind of personal interest in up until that point. And what that book did for me, which became kind of really central as I went into grad school, was it connected this interest in spirituality, specifically kind of spirituality without religion, with larger questions of liberalism and individualism that, as I said, I'd always kind of had an interest in, but they were more sort of academic. Here, those two things, so like my own personal experiences and my interest in spirituality became, in some way, those were implicated in these larger questions about liberalism and ultimately, what a good society is, that I had just never thought to connect. And so that book, in the way it did it in this very kind of personal way, right? It wasn't just this kind of abstract intellectual or philosophical analysis. It was interweaving into personal narratives. It was drawing on particular people's experiences, ordinary people's experiences in America, but that made no difference. I think I identified nevertheless, despite being Canadian. And so, anyways, so I saw like an interest in spirituality as a sort of a way into actually connecting these, like, my own kind of personal questions with these larger philosophical questions that I had about liberalism and individualism and the good society. And so, in a way, it's still odd to me to try and, sometimes when people ask me what the book's about, I could say, oh, well, it's a book about spirituality and the sort of shift from religion to spirituality. But in many ways, it's actually much bigger than that, to me, at least. It's a book about
so much larger than that. No,
right,
for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And spirituality provides a kind of way into those other questions.
Yeah. No, and the reason why I bring that up is, because one, I felt it was your book. The way you're describing Bellah's book is almost the way I felt reading your book. And another way is, as well, is basically in terms of how it described Michael Brooks in his particular way. Because Michael Brooks, had a very huge sort of cultural moment, and people describe him sort of as spiritual but not religious. And yet there's another group of people that really go out and latch on to his sort of Marxist leftist sort of street cred, right? As a spokesperson for Marxism. So when I discovered your writing, your public writing, your back and forth with McManus, I thought it was such an interesting way to go out and to talk and about this issue, because Matt talks about it a lot in terms of individual expressivism, and you're talking about it in terms of some sort of religion of the heart or spirituality. And yet I feel that, and this is something that Michael Brooks, I feel, was always trying to go and describe and talk about in his work, his public work. So I guess, because the other thing too that I find really interesting, that I find you but you address much more in an overt fashion, I guess, than Matt, is this idea of the myth of disenchantment. That there's this undercurrent in your work, basically, that that liberal modernism, or the liberal, romantic liberalism, the way you describe it, is essentially trying to fend off, secularism in a certain way, but also trying to fend off this myth of disenchantment. And I know you're familiar as well with Jason Storm's work in terms of the myth of disenchantment.
Indeed.
So I was wondering maybe if you can talk a bit about that, because, Charles Taylor tries to go out and talk about this in terms of his Malaise and modernity. Bellah obviously tries to go out and address this as well in terms of his work. And I know that, you're approaching this from a very sociological type question. And obviously, your book actually opens up with an epigraph to Durkheim, essentially, that, that religion is not going to go out and disappear. Essentially, it's going to go out and transform. And so So yeah, I mean, I would just be curious to hear, like how all these different facets are informing your work and how this, this back and forth with Matt McManus started, in terms of addressing this idea that there is some type of cultural moment that's happening that is emerging possibly on the left that's much more interested or open to the idea of spirituality as well, or to talk about maybe the problems of secularism and modernity and in capitalism in general. So I was curious to see, like how that was in the background informing your thinking and where you sit with that currently now as well.
Yeah. So, okay. So I think for me, in a way, so let me try and connect what I was saying earlier to as a way of kind of going into this. So, I was having some kind of personal issues, which is what sparked my interest in spirituality. And in a way, I think that's important because when I was thinking about issues of justice and egalitarianism within a kind of political philosophical frame, the question of disenchantment just it just doesn't surface, right? It's not something philosophers generally think about, but to me, it became central. This need for sort of, for lack of a better term, kind of like ultimate or transcendent meaning, something that that gives us a reason to sort of get up in the morning, and also that gives kind of, as I said, meaning to our lives, right? And locates us in some kind of larger picture, whatever that might be, whether it's metaphysical or otherwise. And so I wanted to try and be able to think about these kind of political, philosophical questions while at the same time holding this concern about enchantment. And when you talk about the myth of disenchantment, and this is what Jason's work is kind of trying to point to, we're really talking about this idea, which often is attributed to Weber, Max Weber, that as we move into modernity, basically, kind of we live in this sort of this world where magic and mystery and religion with it all kind of dissolve, right? And so ultimate meaning becomes kind of a non-option, and sort of nihilism reigns, right? We live in this sort of ultra rationalist kind of mechanical universe, and this was something that Weber wrote about in a famous lecture called "Science as a Vocation." And I mean, Jason has done work on this, and I've recently published an article on this about how it's actually a lot more complicated, even within Weber. What he actually meant by that is a lot more complicated than people think. But I think the common view is that he was saying, now that we're modern, we're not religious, we're not, we don't believe in magic. Mystery has kind of just dissipated, and this has real implications for for people, because we might crave meaning, but we no longer believe in that stuff, kind of thing. And Jason, and so I sort of, my big kind of, I guess, counter argument, and I think it follows from what Jason is saying, is that it's just not empirically true that we are disenchanted, right? I mean, you just have to point to the flourishing of conspiracy theories or any number of, astrology, all these kinds of things that are not empirically verifiable that, just seem to flourish in modernity. So we, and spirituality, of course, another example, right? So part of this is trying to show that, yes, Weber might have been right to say that there was kind of pressure, in a sense, in modernity placed upon us through sort of institutions, whether it's education or science, to not enchant the world, right? To sort of live or lean towards nihilism. But I think that my view as a kind of cultural sociologist is that humans are just kind of meaning-making creatures, and so we almost sort of naturally enchant the world. It's very difficult to live life without some form of kind of ultimate meaning, and often, I mean, people can do it, but it's very difficult, and most don't. And so, I was interested in sort of the different forms of enchantment that exist today. And I think spirituality is a dominant one, right? That this move from religion to spirituality is one among other ways in which people are re-enchanting the world. This is I think what Charles Taylor argues as well in his book A Secular Age, that a secular age isn't just a world where there's no religion, it's what he calls a spiritual supernova, right? They are all different forms and varieties of kind of religious expression, which so there's a kind of pluralization of enchantments. And so to sort of try and connect that then to the question of say what's happening on the left, I mean, you could say that there is an awakening, and potentially, arguably maybe among younger people like millennials, younger, of an awareness of the need for enchantment, both as a deeply human need, but also a kind of collective need, like something that is central to the fostering of collective solidarity and moral action, right? And political action, right? So, and activism. So I think that if there is an emerging cultural moment, and I guess I would say that Matt is probably more invested in that idea than I am. I'm not sure how much I'm committed to that, but I guess I would say that I'd like there to be, and I think that any successful movement is going to be one that acknowledges this deeply human need for enchantment, right? To sort of seek a larger, to locate people within some larger narrative and some larger picture.
Yeah, oh, beautiful. Yeah, no, and I mean, this is why, I mean, I keep bringing up Michael Brooks as well. I mean, because Michael Brooks was deeply invested in kind of Buddhism in the West, right? I mean, he was a self-described Buddhist, practicing Buddhist, kind of sort of like the Sam Harris, but he was obviously very much, a Marxist and on the left. Right. And yet he wasn't willing to go out. He would actually just go out and, when he would be talking to his more kind of materialist Marxist friends, that, he would be sitting around encouraging them. No, you need to go out and meditate. You need to go out and take up these various forms of practices. Right. And we need to go out and fuse these larger questions of meaning and not let the right go out and co-opt these ideas, or particularly religion itself. Right. Because the right usually is very good at going and co-opting particularly Christianity right now. But I mean, he was like, no, very much the way you're describing it is that, like there's a variety now of not only religious experiences that are out there, but there's a variety of religious traditions, right? So obviously it could give problems to eclecticism, but it can also go out and open people up that are particularly allergic to various forms of traditional religious traditions to go out and pick up another one. Right. And this is what Charles Taylor goes out and taps into beautifully as well, in terms of, the way you're describing it in there, in terms of a supernova type idea. So I guess my question though is that because you chose to go out and focus in on the idea of romanticism, and I'm kind of wondering why, because there's also a big flourishing, or people that are deeply interested in German idealism or idealism proper. And Taylor taps into idealism, obviously his work on Hegel and stuff like that. So I was wondering why you focus more on the romanticism aspect, because I feel that there is an infusion of idealism throughout your writing, and you obviously wouldn't be allergic to it. So because obviously there's people like Slavoj Zizek right now that's, written quite a bit on German idealism, on Hegel and Schelling as well. And that's actually been another theme as well, kind of around my podcast, is that, why are all these young people not only interested in spirituality, but why is there seem to be this huge cohort of people that are flocking to Hegel and German idealism right now and stuff like that, particularly on the left, right? And it's funny to me as well that, you have Zizek and Jordan Peterson out there that, kind of sort of the debate of the ages, whatever we can go and even call it that. But so, yeah, I was wondering why the term romantic liberalism, and particularly romantic liberal modernity, instead of kind of talking about ideas of postmodernity, or why did you decide to go and frame it specifically in that category? Because, I mean, when I was reading you, I was like, well, Matt's talking about the rise of the new right, postmodern conservatism. And to me, it seems like maybe on the left, this is some sort of variety of maybe of left postmodernity sort of way. So I was wondering why you decided to go just with, romantic liberalism and, attaching it specifically to the modern project.
Great. Okay, so it's a great question. And I'm glad I have the opportunity to talk about this. So, okay, so part of it has to do with the fact that, and so I think that romanticism is. So I guess I would put it this way, and this is where I guess I would probably disagree with Matt. Although I haven't read enough of his work to sort of know his. And it seems like he produces it so quickly that I wouldn't be able to keep up anyway. So.
He writes faster than I can read. No, that man is a machine when it comes to this stuff. Yeah.
So, but I guess my basic view, it's not just semantics. It's not just that. So the reason why I'm a cultural sociologist by kind of identification, and what that means is that I basically think that that culturally speaking, there's not really that many differences between, say, the quote unquote modern project and the quote unquote postmodern era. So, and so I'm quite skeptical of the idea that we have that we have a sort of decline of meta narratives or something like this, or if anything, I would say we just have a sort of plurality of meta narratives. And I think romanticism is probably one of the dominant ones. So, I would follow Charles Taylor's kind of genealogy of modernity, seeing expressivism, romantic expressivism, as kind of a central facet of the modern identity, right?
Okay.
I mean, he has a lot of books on this. The shortest is The Ethics of Authenticity, or the Malaise of Modernity, where he talks about how expressivism is kind of central to modernity. It always has been. And the 1960s was really just a kind of revival. It was just this sort of, just flourishing of romantic sentiment. And I would argue we were kind of in another romantic revival of a certain kind. And so when I look out and I see, what's happening both on the left, as you say, this growing interest in German idealism, Hegel, and so forth, and then on the right, what Matt calls postmodern conservatism. I don't necessarily see it as postmodern. I just see it as a kind of new flourishing of this facet of the modern identity, which is romanticism, in a progressive and a kind of conservative seems an odd term because there's nothing really conservative about Donald Trump, right? It seems more what's the term? I mean,
wild.
Yeah, exactly. Rear guard. In any case, it's so you have different versions of romanticism. And in a way, this is also important. Why did I choose the term romantic liberalism? So one is that I wanted to be able to trace a tradition. I don't think that this is totally new. In fact, I would agree with someone like Patrick Deneen descriptively to say that this is kind of an outgrowth of liberalism, right? It's Millian liberalism, liberalism of a certain kind that kind of, so it has the same sort of seeds of the liberal tradition, but it did take a slightly different shift in the 60s, and it kind of this focus on expressivity, on expressive freedom, became central to the liberal tradition in that era, and it is today. So I wanted to be able to trace this tradition and talk about it as a tradition. And I also wanted to be able to kind of in so doing, draw sort of boundaries around what is a good form and what, for lack of a better term, what's a good form and what's a bad form. Like, I think that there's something, this is the normative political philosopher in me. I think that there's something noble and I guess defensible to a romantic liberalism. So one that is romantic in the sense that it's sees as kind of core ideal as being expressive freedom, but is liberal in the sense, in a number of senses, but really in the sense that it kind of respects moral equality, and it has a sort of private-public distinction at its core. That I see as really central, and I also think, just empirically, if you want to understand spirituality, it may be useful to note to your listeners that this isn't some kind of marginal phenomenon. So something like 40% of Canadians identify as spiritual but not religious, right? It's like an extremely common signifier. And so I'm trying to capture something that I think is widespread. So it's not really like I can sort of, I let the data decide what I was going to look at, and then I gave it a name, romantic liberalism, and then I just wanted to give her some kind of normative justification or defense of that empirical development.
Gotcha. Okay. Because you talk about romantic liberalism, and obviously, it seems almost like your preferred term for it would be to go and describe it as some sort of religion of the heart, or maybe using Robert Bellah in terms of some form of civil religion, possibly. That seems to be.
So I would say they're different. So
Okay.
So this is where it could get complicated trying to explain
Yeah.
this, but basically the way I would put it is that what I call the religion of the heart is this form of spirituality that I think a lot of people have, and it's a very personal, kind of private approach to spirituality, one about seeking meaning in your own individual life, and is largely, in that sense, kind of therapeutic and more kind of concentrated on your own private sphere. Now, the sociologist in me says that there's something good about that people should have the opportunity to sort of pursue their own private spiritual paths, but that on its own it's not sufficient to bring about a good society. And so I would see like Bellah's conception of civil religion as being this kind of complementary but different form of religion. I don't see them as mutually exclusive. In fact, I would argue the opposite, that they work really well together. So when you are at home, or you want to go to a meditation class, you're engaged in this more the religion of the heart type spirituality. But when you go out and you protest in the streets, say in the name of justice, you're there's a kind of religious dimension of that to that. It's more of the civil religion kind, right? So they both have different, to put it in sociological terms, they have different sort of functions in a liberal society, both of which are necessary, but which you cannot you would be, I guess it would be a mistake to try and exclude one. In fact, they almost need each other, right?
Yeah. No, beautiful. No, for sure. Because they seem to be overlapping to me as well in terms of, but obviously, like all these various terms. I guess because reading your work, because reading Matt's work and the idea, like he really taps into this idea that we sort of have entered some sort of postmodern moment, or almost some sort of postmodern. He interprets it in terms of some form of cultural sphere that seems to have developed out of modernity. But I could see why there's a lot of people, maybe even people like Bruno Latour or Habermas, that they kind of hint at that, no, the problem is that we've never really been modern type idea.
Right. Yeah. Well, in a way, I guess I would probably put myself more in that camp.
Okay.
I think it's also that if I read Matt right, I think his influences are slightly different. He's coming out of the sort of Harvey, Jameson school of thinking about postmodernism. And so, it's tied to his particular kind of aesthetic and particular, this is me speculating. I don't know his work well enough to be able to say for sure, but certainly as sort of somebody coming from cultural sociology, we are more in the camp where we're thinking there's actually a lot more continuity between modernity and so-called post-modernity as people want to admit, right?
Yeah.
At least culturally. Things like technology do change the quote, as it were, nature of the game. Like, so there are kind of differences and there's social structural differences, but culturally speaking, it's not clear to me that that there's that much difference.
Gotcha. Okay. Because I mean, obviously, Jason Storm has come up, excuse me, with the idea of some sort of meta modernity now, right? I'm not sure if
Yeah.
you've read his most recent book and stuff like that. So, I mean,
So,
and people have started talking about the idea of some post modernity, right? We seem to be entered in. So, I mean,
let me just, I haven't, so I haven't read that book.
okay, gotcha.
It's on my list. But so one way of, but I mean, so I haven't read that. I'm very, very interested in reading it because I take Jason to be interested in giving us a kind of intellectual framework for thinking about reviving ideals and normative commitments in a postmodern situation, right? Where skepticism is not the sort of the default or not the sort of reigning imperative. And I think so. If I guess sometimes I think that the conversation about postmodernity seems to me somewhat. It seems to me somewhat. It reflects too much preoccupations that are very, very specific to intellectuals and not specific to the vast majority of other people. Like, it seems to me like it really has to do with a particular kind of intellectual climate where so and I do think that if you read the kind of classic philosophical takes on postmodernity, it is often referring to sort of the conditions of intellectual production, right? Like, how do academics justify their work, and how do scientists just like, and that to me they're interesting philosophical questions, and Jason is doing work to try and provide us with a framework to be able to justify this stuff that doesn't fall back into the skepticism of postmodern work or style. But in terms of empirical analysis of what's going on in the world around us, I'm not convinced that the concept of postmodernity is all that useful, only because, as I said, I think that it tends to reflect the preoccupations and concerns of intellectual classes.
Gotcha. Okay. No, totally. Yeah. No, I mean, well, because even Jason's work in terms of meta modernity, it's interesting because he's much more interested in the idea of kind of superseding the idea of critical theory, right, as an approach within religious studies. And I'm so behind that because one of the main reasons why I wasn't interested in going out and doing graduate studies in religious studies was this constant deconstructive thunder that was everywhere. It leads to nowhere, and it was just so, like, to me, so toxic, and I wanted nothing to go out and do with it once I was done, because I literally walked into university enchanted. I want to go back, and here I was, at the time as well, in my early 20s and stuff like that. I had gone up to the Montreal Zen Center. I actually studied, Zen for over 10 years up at the Montreal Zen Center. But once my degree was done with me, my idea of religion had just completely dissolved, and I'd lost all enchantment.
Just falling apart. Right. Well, I mean, and I do think that, education is a source of disenchantment, right? I mean,
yeah,
it really is. And religious education, funny enough, I mean, not sort of theological education, but the academic study thereof, deeply disenchanting.
Yeah, absolutely. No, so I mean, so that's an interesting kind of sidebar to that as well. I guess because the other thing too that I find really interesting in your work is that, I mean, not only are you kind of addressing the idea of the myth of disenchantment, or what is enchantment, instead of just kind of tacking along the secularism line, which I find, I mean, is useful. The way Charles Taylor has gone out and framed it, but the way you kind of talked about it in your work along with Jason, I find it to be more palpable and alive to me. The other question too that I had is, how and why did you get interested in the idea of kind of the wellness side, addiction treatment and recovery, to religion and spirituality? Because that's another tack that I find it's really interesting, because it's not just a question of meaning; it's actually a question of well-being and human flourishing, along with larger questions of meaning, and I would even throw in transcendence, and and stuff like that. Because there's tons of people within religious studies now that are obviously interested in the psychedelic kind of twist of things and the idea of consciousness and stuff like that. So I was curious, how did that come about for you through your work? Why did you choose to go and focus in like on 12-step and AA and that type of stuff? How did that come about?
Yeah, so it's useful to note some of the kind of common criticisms in the academic literature of spirituality, because in a way they became they framed the project, right? I had to, who was I responding to? So one dominant criticism is generally kind of from, we'll say religious conservatives, right? Either conservative or communitarian, this kind of view that the shift from religion to spirituality is really one that means it's kind of the flourishing of narcissism, of kind of rabid individualism, of a complete rejection of tradition, of morality, right? And so it goes along with the very common conservative story about the 60s, right? Where everything fell apart after the 60s. So that was kind of one critique or set of criticisms that I really wanted to respond to. And I wanted to think about what particular case studies could help me think through those criticisms. And then the other one was actually from the left, from a more, there's kind of neo-Marxist versions, and then there's kind of a post-structuralist version. But it's basically the idea that spirituality is, to use a term that's actually the title of a well-known book in this field, it's the opiate of the bourgeoisie. In other words, when people today, middle-class people today are interested in spirituality, they're really looking for a kind of an escapist, individualistic form of religion that's completely in line with a sort of consumerist lifestyle that asks nothing of them in terms of sort of changing their politics or changing the structures of society. It's a purely accommodationist message that, that is politically quietist, basically, and passive. And so this is, again, one of those kind of criticisms that I was really wrestling with, because, one that I could sort of see the truth of in certain ways, and I could recognize its veracity, but at the same time felt was oversimplified in a lot of ways. And so the AA case study was a fascinating one, because it became this way of thinking through both of these criticisms, these very dominant criticisms, right? And sort of putting some kind of empirical bones, so to speak, on this theoretical analysis, right? You have these two big critiques from the right and the left, which are very much, they are philosophical or theoretical critiques. And I'm like, well, why don't we test these out? Why don't we see what's going on in one of these places, right? And so, the interesting thing about AA is that it's both, yes, a clear evidence of a shift from religion to spirituality. I mean, everyone at AA calls themselves spiritual. It's really focused on your own spiritual recovery. But at the same time, it's extremely communal, and it works in this way that is, deeply moral. And you see this in covered alcoholics and members of the program and the fellowship. So, in that sense, it's a clear kind of counter sort of argument to the conservative criticism, right?
Yeah.
Like, here's an example of spirituality which is quite the opposite of what you're saying it is, even though it still works according to the same, it's still individualistic, it still focuses on individuals kind of pursuing it, but at the same time, it's not just, members call it selfish, but it's actually not selfish in its kind of implications and in its consequences. And then on the other side, I was interested in AA as this kind of place where you both had this very therapeutic, personal dimension, which of course is central to recovery, right? The alcoholics who join AA become, they do it because they want to get better. They want to recover from alcoholism. So there's this obvious therapeutic dimension, and the left-wing critique of spirituality would say, well, yeah, that's all it is. It's just about people getting better so that they can go out into a corrupt, unjust world.
Capitalist system.
Right,
Start
exactly.
consuming the yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And what I found at the fellowship that I did a year's work of field work at was quite the opposite. That it wasn't that they were just going back out to the world and just sort of like passively conforming to the dictates of capitalist modernity, but rather were AA was giving them the emotional and psychological resources to be able to become engaged citizens, right? So I call it in the book a generative institution. It's like, and I don't think it's the only one, but I think that we need these kinds of institutions, these places where people can sort of recover and deal with personal issues so that they can join public life and become productive, engaged citizens. So I guess in bringing that to light, my hope was to try and shed light on this important function of these kind of more therapeutic type approaches to spirituality, which I think the sort of leftist critique completely misses. Right.
Totally. No, for sure. No, and I mean, you're lecturing to the
the converted, of course. Of course.
Yeah, I mean, Ernie Kurtz and William White are actually some of my other kind of heroes. The work that they've done on 12-step and obviously AA and all 12 forms of 12-step recovery. I mean, because it's not just AA anymore. I mean, you have Buddhist fellowships that have kind of adopted. Yeah. I mean, there's just a plethora of it. I mean, the other thing too is, I mean, if you looked at my podcast, I mean, I recently had Sean Kelly on, and I mean, his work is completely born out of the human potential movement and humanistic psychology. So this is, I mean, you're just preaching to the choir even more in terms of this. But this is one of the reasons why I wanted to connect with you, because when I do interact with guys like Matt and stuff like that, I mean, his whole circle of influence and stuff like this is very much on that, right? It's like, it's a Marxist critique of religion, right? It's the opiate of the masses. It doesn't go out and provide any sort of function. If anything, it's just, it's just sublimating or alienating people into, what capitalism really is in terms of that. And like you, I mean, that was what I was faced in religious studies all the time, right? Is that I had to go out and take one or two of these narratives and apply it to whatever I was studying. And at the end, I was just like, there's no way I can't do this. So, but my other home was actually, because I double majored, and my other major is actually in the applied human science department. And there, basically, they're counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists. So their approach is much more functional, right? I mean, it's all about, like, how can we actually go out and help people grow, develop, and get a greater sense of meaning? And exactly like you describe is, to go out and facilitate people's participation in in democracy. Go out there,
right,
get involved, and I mean, and obviously use the functions of what mutual aid support groups like AA can go out and foster and help. I mean, it could go out and help you maintain a sense of peace while you're going out and going out and doing that, and obviously, not sliding into substance use or burnout through whatever type of work that you're actually going out and doing. So, I mean, to read your work, it's just like, I'm like, yes, I'm like, somebody's out there trying to go out and address, this idea of on the left and on the right of this particular critique of religion. And it's just, I just think it's a shame.
Yeah, I
think that the left today really needs to. I mean, every time I've interacted with Matt, I keep kind of poking and prodding him to follow Michael Brooks' lead. That religion could go out and be a fantastic vehicle for the left to go out and mobilize. I mean, there is a Catholic left, there is a Christian left, more broadly speaking, that are interested in these questions as well. Like, why aren't you guys bridging into it, particularly as academics? I mean, I wouldn't say that's necessarily everybody. I guess because the other thing too around all this, because obviously you studied under Will Kinlicka. So I was wondering, because his take on liberalism is quite interesting as well. And I was wondering how that came in to influence all of this, and how did you bridge what we're talking about now in terms of religion and spirituality with him? Like, he doesn't seem like, well, I mean, granted, Taylor probably had a huge influence on him, but he doesn't seem to be the type that would be very interested in these types of questions around religion and stuff like that. So I was curious how that came about and how that bridged in eventually to your thinking and stuff like that.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. So, I mean, one thing I will just preface with is that, you would be amazed how diverse Will's interests are. It's
Okay.
just like, he seems to just be just endlessly curious about lots and lots and lots and lots of things. And his ability to connect and synthesize things is still astounds me. But the way that I kind of pitched it to him at the beginning to try and tell him that, look, this isn't totally out of left field for you. Like there is clear connections. Is that so I see, and maybe I should have said this earlier. I see the shift from religion to spirituality that's taken place since the '60s as being a kind of religious wing of a much larger shift in cultural and moral shift in society, which actually has more to do with the rise of romantic liberalism. So I think that if there's a larger narrative in the book, it is about this emergence of what I call romantic liberal modernity, a shift that's taken place, and I think go some way to explaining everything from the fact that millennials today just take it for granted that women and men are equal, that gays and lesbians and trans people deserve equal dignity and respect, right? That that colonialism is a very bad thing. That there's all these things that have taken place since the '60s. This kind of moral shift in liberal democracies and beyond, which I'm trying to put under this larger conceptual umbrella that is romantic liberal modernity, which at its base has to do with a kind of shift within liberalism, where you have the same two core ideals of equal moral equality and individual freedom, but there's a slight shift in that understanding of freedom, which has more to do with, it's a move away from a kind of rational conception of freedom and towards a kind of romantic expressive conception of freedom, which really has to do with people being able to be who they feel themselves to be. So being able to express their true selves, and also receiving recognition from whether it's others or the state. So this is the kind of Hegelian, being seen as who you claim yourself to be, right? And that, I think, is also central to multiculturalism, right? If you think about, and if you look at Will's story of the emergence of multiculturalism, he sees it almost liberal multiculturalism, at least as we Canadians think about it, as a kind of outgrowth of liberalism, where liberalism suddenly becomes conscious of the fact that individuals are not all the same, that individuals have different identities, and therefore, what justice requires, equal concern and respect, requires that we recognize and grant respect to people's different identities, right? Whether they are Jews, Muslims, whether they are Indian or Thai or African, this is what the multicultural project is. It's about fundamentally asking, what does a society that gives equal concern and respect require? And multiculturalism, liberal multiculturalism, says that it requires people to have, public recognition. And so I think that the shift from religion to spirituality, although it seems on the surface kind of completely outside of that, I don't think it's outside of it at all. I think that you've had these two things emerge at the same time because they're actually very closely connected, at least in terms of their kind of underlying moral and cultural logic. It really has to do with increased recognition. Just as the spiritual but not religious say, don't just call me a Catholic, or don't just call me a Christian or a Muslim. I have my own spiritual practice that I myself want to be able to pursue. I have my own individual path that I'm pursuing. It's not this larger thing that everyone else is doing. It's something unique to me. It's the same kind of thing as when you have, trans people saying recognize me for who I am, right? Like respect my individual identity. Give me that recognition, right? And it's important that I have the recognition that in a world where you're not recognized as who you feel yourself to be, there's a certain kind of harm perpetrated.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I mean, the idea of recognition, I'm happy to hear you kind of elaborate on that, is because, I mean, the reason why I brought up idealism before, right, is, I mean, it's this idea of recognition and stuff like that. So that's interesting. Okay. So I didn't realize that within your framing of romanticism, I mean, there's some deep Hegelian thinking in there as well.
Totally. And
Gotcha.
I mean, that's the thing. Yeah, no, totally. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not speaking in, for partly for reasons that I want to keep the narrative somewhat welcoming, and I don't want to immediately, intimidate everybody, coming to the book. I decided to leave Hegel's name out of it.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, well, okay, like I knew, like obviously Taylor is in the background, but I thought maybe, well, because even Robert Bellah, obviously his work on evolution, or the idea that religion plays a huge factor in terms of cultural evolution. I think is almost an update, a much more interesting update on the idea of just somehow retreating or going back to Hegelian type thinking, dialectical thinking. So I think his much more sophisticated theory, or the way to go out and frame it, and that's why I love Robert Bellah so much. Okay, so I mean, so do you think? Well, but you literally think that this is coming into being? It's not some sort of reformed liberalism in another way.
No, I do think that it is, and I think it's evolving. So like, there's a part of me that, so in one sense, it's a historical analysis. It's trying to make sense of what's happened since the 1960s.
Okay.
To liberalism. So, I want to try and explain the changes in popular consciousness that I kind of laid out, but also the legal changes and the political changes, right? And the kind of animating what I call social imaginary to the feminist movement, the environmental movement. I want to try and give a kind of cultural, sociological, historical picture of what tied all of these things together and how they have kind of shaped the social order that many of us today take for granted.
Gotcha.
Now, at the same time, I'm currently working on a book with one of my colleagues, which is looking at spirituality today and how it maybe is changing. And there's a part of me that thinks that the idea of romantic liberalism is increasingly
almost under attack as well.
Yeah, so I mean, that is the term. Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say. But I'm always very cautious about this because it's a very controversial and touchy topic. Like, I guess, I do I do kind of try and defend romantic liberalism. Like, I continue to think that that's, if I'm being honest, that's just like, it's me. It's sort of that's the tradition I would put myself in.
Yeah,
but
even Matt McManus has changed his. I mean, he completely changed his discourse, but I mean, he's framing it much more that particularly the socialist left needs to be no. We're not trying to destroy liberalism. We're building on top of liberalism. So he would actually go and self-describe himself as a liberal socialist, much more around C.B. Macpherson's work and stuff like that, right? Right. Socialism would be an outgrowth of liberalism if properly done and achieved in a certain way. And this is where I get, because when I came into Matt's work, I very much identified as a sort of Charles Taylor, Robert Bellah, and I was said, well, I guess I am a communitarian, and communitarianism was a bit of a thing for a while due to people, and there's a left-wing version of that versus a right-wing version. And it was only through Matt's work, reading his work, that all of a sudden I realized, like, oh my God, like he's attacking communitarianism and being in terms of like this can actually turn out to be extremely conservative. And I was like, conservative? Like, what are you talking about? Like, right? And it could be oppressive in a certain way if the community is too too tightly knit, where the idea of individuality can go out and flourish within this tight knit community of any sort in a certain way. And that's where my mental sort of construct really got rattled reading Matt's work, is like, well, wait a minute, communitarianism is not so hip and cool the way, and then obviously Patrick Deneen's work started to hit, take on it's a life of its own online and stuff like that. And obviously now me discovering your work and reading a bit more in terms of Will's work as well. So it's been an ongoing education for me. And I appreciate everything that you guys have been putting out there as well. So I guess my question would be, what's your take on communitarianism today? And if that's even, alive or well, or is that something that kind of came for a moment and sort of blipped?
So I think that the liberal communitarian debates that took place in the 80s and 90s, which is where that term really kind of, emerged most prominently. If you go back and you read all that, and I was fascinated with that stuff. Like in my undergrad, I ate that stuff up, and precisely for the same reason. Like I really thought of myself, if you had two camps and there was liberals and communitarians, well, I was a communitarian, right? But really the debate actually was really quite specific. It was really about how you think about the nature of the self, right?
Yeah.
Is the self, I'm putting in generalities, but is the self atomistic, right? So this is Sandel's view of Rawls, right? That the self exists prior to community, right? That we are ultimately individuals, kind of atomistic individuals, and our identities are not they're not the product of community. And the communitarian view was basically saying that no, you cannot have selves without community, right? It's community that kind of gives content to the self, right? And this all came out of Sandel's big critique of the original position, Rawls's famous thought experiment, he imagined what people behind a kind of veil of ignorance, how they would collectively decide about, the rules of society. And Sandel said, well, wait a second. That's crazy, because if they're behind a veil of ignorance, it means they don't know their identity, and it means they're not really people, right? They don't have real selves, right? Yeah. Like you actually have to sort of, people are not these kind of atomistic things that stand behind a veil of ignorance. They have particular commitments that derive from their, the communities that they belong to, and the particular socialization things that have happened in, the families and all this kind of stuff. And so, but and actually what changed my whole view on this was Will's book, his first book, which was actually his PhD thesis, which is Liberalism, Community, and Culture. Yeah. Right. Where he takes up this whole debate and tries to say that in many ways, there's a kind of straw man being created by communitarians like Michael Sandel, and that ultimately liberalism does accept that that individuals like selves are, constituted by their communities, and that there is a way of thinking about this that's not so black and white, right? And in a way, I think that this is what Charles Taylor is advocating for. What you really want is you want to be able to have a recognition of the importance of community, by which I mean like traditions and relationships, and these things are absolutely central to people's identities, right? We want to live in a world, we'll flourish most in a world where people value these things, and where the state is not constantly trying to attack those things. And yet at the same time, you also want to let people reject the traditions that they grew up in, if they so chose, right? That's the sort of classic thing, right? You want people to be able to have the comfort of the tradition and communities that they grow up in, while at the same time having the freedom to leave, because sometimes you do, and tradition and community can be completely kind of suffocating. And so the real question, which, to be honest, the liberal communitarian distinction ultimately doesn't like resolve. The real question is, how do you strike that balance, right? How do you do that? And both left and right struggle with that. I mean, if you look at any, and this is central to not just religious communities, but political communities, right? Activist circles. Like, how do you both have sufficient? How do you both value the community as a whole and the traditions that keep you and define you as a community, while at the same time giving people freedom to think for themselves, to do their own thing, to go their own way, right? It's the central problem, right? And one of the reasons Emil Durkheim was kind of a central figure in my book is precisely because that is the question that he struggled with. It was the question of modernity too. It's like individual versus society, right? And how do you strike that balance? And I try and propose some through the case studies versions of how I think this could work, but in a way.
Well, but this is the interesting thing about religion, right? Because, I mean, we're talking about structure. I mean, this is the other thing, too, that I want to bring up, because, I mean, Taylor and, I mean, all of these thinkers, a lot of them focus in on the idea of identity, right? The idea of the modern self. And how does that go out and come about, through exactly the way you beautifully described it, through, construction or co-construction with community and stuff like that. But religion is much more... I mean, in a certain way, religion is not against any of that. I mean, they would want a functional, person to develop a good sense of self and sense of identity. But the idea of religion in a certain way, depending, I mean, where what religion is the idea of transcendence, right? Is there any, these sorts of experiences where the self all of a sudden becomes dissolved? And it's not to go necessarily be dissolved to become nothing, but a lot of them become nothing only to become fully more who they are, to actually go out and re-engage back in society. And your case study around the addiction treatment and recovery in AA12, is a great example of that as well, right? Because a lot of them are wrestling with that, right? Or even some of them are wrestling with the ideas of, their drug-induced states that they had originally when they started to go and consume various kinds of substances. And all of a sudden they come back and they're like, well, that's not sustainable. But yet those experiences pointed me towards something. What is this something that we're actually going out and talking about? So maybe it's an idea of God, or, depending on what kind of reinterpretation you have. So this is the other question to me that I want to talk to you about, is that, I mean, it's not just meaning or hermeneutical sort of interpretation of what all this is. I mean, religion focuses on the idea of these sort of transpersonal experiences. And that's why I actually interviewed Sean Kelly in my interest in, in humanistic psychology and people like Maslow that talk about these ideas of having peak experiences. So I was wondering, if you wrestled, or do you think about some of that stuff in the background as you've been wrestling with these ideas of meaning and community and the idea of identity as well, throughout your writing?
Yeah, so it's a great question.
I realize you're not a theologian. You're not, you even self-describe as a sociologist. I mean, I realize a sociologist is not necessarily a theologian.
No, and yeah. I mean, there are there's a sort of short version response, and then there's the day-long response, right? Which
gotcha.
And I mean so I'll give you the, for obvious reasons, I'll give you the short version.
Yeah.
So I do think about these things, but so for a couple of reasons, I don't really discuss them. So the first is actually, it's a purely, and your listeners will be disappointed probably to hear this, but it's a purely kind of disciplinary reason, which is to say, I wrote this book as a sociologist for sociologists, and you just won't get published. So, if you start going down if you start engaging with theological questions.
Gotcha.
I mean, that's obviously a generality, but I think it's true. I think it is true. And so I'm not totally, I don't think I'm making that up. And I mean, I have some evidence for that. I wrote an afterword that didn't get included because it basically strayed into the questions that you're raising about, I was very aware while writing that my book itself could be seen as a sort of symptom of disenchantment, right? Which is to say,
yeah.
it could be seen as a kind of disenchanting force, right? I'm bringing social science is probably it's not surprising to me that it was Max Weber, one of the founding quote unquote fathers of sociology that diagnosed the modern world as disenchanted, right? Disenchantment and sociology have, they're very closely intimately related, right? And part of the reason why, if we do live in a disenchanted world, it's because of the absolute dominance of social science as a kind of a set of discourses, right? And they shape how we think about ourselves and truth and the world. And so I was very aware while writing that this could be a kind of force for disenchantment, for lack of a better term. And so I wrote this afterward to try and, it's very brief, but try to say something about how I think you might be able to reconcile the sociological analysis I give with a more, let's say, you could say theological or psychological analysis, right? One which doesn't totally reduce spirituality to the social, right? But sees these experiences as not just reflective of some kind of collective consciousness, which is what I wanted to talk about, but also as maybe being a window into the divine, of some, of the transcendent. So I continue to believe that those two things are not irreconcilable. It's just the case that my book is just kind of mute on that other dimension. And I guess I should mention one other reason why I do that is because I think that at the very least I'm offering a perspective that goes against the grain of, like, there is, and I know this well, there are bookshelves full of books on spirituality which focus purely on the kind of individual, the sort of spiritual path, right? And I think that there's a lot of good in that, but I wanted to offer a different perspective on this, to say that because I am partly a communitarian, I do think that even our most transcendent experiences are in some sense dependent upon the existence of community and ritual, right? So, and I often think that if there's any trend, and I agree with Bellah here, if there's any trend in modern religious life that needs to be checked, it's this trend, this sort of emphasis on individuals pursuing their own thing, regardless of the communities and traditions that they belong to, and more of a kind of balancing of a respect and appreciation for, yes, individual experiences of transcendence, but also the communal conditions that make those possible.
Gotcha. Well, either way, I mean, I'll say, I mean, like Bellah, you strike a fine chord, my friend. I mean, I'm very reading your book. It was the same thing when I was reading Bellah, because I mean, I can figure out, like, like I knew in his saying that you actually quote quite well, like, I mean, if you're doing social science, it should be a form of public philosophy, right? If done right, right? So it should be concerned with the idea of the good and stuff like that. And when I saw that in your work, I was like, nice, and but as well, I mean, Bellah is such a complicated figure. And I was never really able to go out and figure out, like, is he a theologian? Is he a sociologist, an anthropologist? Like, how is he, and at the end of the day, I just think he was an amazing philosopher that, or even a philosopher of religion. So, and his work is just, outside of this world. So, I mean, your book strikes along those lines for me. And it's one of the main reasons why I've been so excited. Reading Matt's work as well has been like this illuminating for me. Like, I'm just like, wow, like there's a young cohort of young professors right now, particularly Canadian philosophers and thinkers that are up and coming right now that are, to me, so exciting. So, I mean, thank you for that. I mean, I'm a huge fan of both of your works. I guess maybe we can end on that, because I didn't have time to go and read your review of Bellah's biography. And you reviewed it, and I didn't have time to read it, or I couldn't get my hands on it. So I was curious to.
Yeah.
To maybe kind of end on that and your review of that book, and maybe kind of Bellah's legacy moving forward. Where how do you see that?
Yeah, well, look, let me just say thank you so much for such kind words. I'm humbled and yeah, I'm slightly embarrassed. But one thing I'll just say, yeah, about that essay, which it actually isn't public yet, so it's in press, so it hasn't been
Oh, okay. I thought it was
published
already
yet.
okay. Gotcha.
It's not out, so I'm happy to send it to you if you'd like. But I wrote that book, so there basically, if anyone who's interested in Robert Bellah should go read the recent biography of him by an Italian sociologist by the name of Matteo Bartolini. And it's a really beautiful book. I mean, both the actual book itself is good. It's really well written and it's unbelievably well researched. I think he spent like 20 years looking at letters. So obviously read all of Bellah's work, but also looked at personal letters, did interviews with his family members,
oh wow,
and he also, I think, spent time with Bellah himself before he passed away.
Oh,
so
okay.
And you find out things about Bellah, I mean, which are really, juicy. Things like about his sex life and
oh no way, okay.
Really, it kind of mines Bellah's psyche and personal history, and things that happened to Bellah, like that I actually wasn't aware of. Two of his daughters died.
Oh my God, I didn't realize.
Yeah,
that.
like real tragedies that shaped his, I think, also his religious leanings. Because he was a kind of an avowed Marxist atheist in his early adulthood. Yeah, and
he took refuge at McGill.
Indeed, he did. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that was also new to me too. I didn't know that he had a Canadian connection. But I guess I would say I think that Bellah would he definitely deserves the term theologian just as much as sociologist, right?
Gotcha.
Ultimately he was a humanist. He really believed in just drawing from all of the humanities and social sciences, right, to provide what he called a synoptic vision, right? Like there's these divisions between disciplines are ultimately arbitrary. They're the product of professional guilds that are trying to kind of like protect their own intellectual turf, more than they're not created in the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge, right? They have their own sort of there's vested interest to keep these divisions up, and obviously they have other, they work to some extent, but they are a barrier. And I think he recognized that, which is why he drew so broadly from different disciplines, and he was just so good at it, at synthesizing. So yeah, I mean, I continue to be indebted to his work, and that essay is just my attempt to try and spell out what I see as the most important kind of strands within Bellah's thought and life.
Great. Okay. Well, I mean, I look forward to reading all of that, especially the biography as well. I've been eyeing that for a little while now.
It's really worth the read. It's really worth it.
Yeah. Gotcha. Super. Well, listen, I mean, I so appreciate your time. And, I'd love to eventually have you back on again and pick your brains. I know you guys have got so much more work in the pipeline as well. I mean, I keep encouraging Matt. I mean, I'm amazed with the productivity, but also the work that you guys are doing. And, since discovering your collaboration, their short collaboration online up at Arrow Magazine, and the idea of a new engaged left, I mean, it's been so inspiring for me to read and to see you guys in action and your thinking and stuff like that. And the fact that you're homegrown Canadian is...
Indeed, no, we're rocking Canada, and I hope, I mean, I'm a very proud Canadian, so I wear it proudly, for sure.
Super. Okay. Well, to be continued. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it.